Okay, well, hello everybody. Welcome to O-Books Presents. My name's Ben Crabe, and at O-Books we publish books for spiritual living from all the corners of the body, mind, and spirit section of the bookshop. Today we're really excited. We've got a new author with us, Anthony Peake, who's publishing a book with us next year. And Anthony's a writer who deals with the borderline areas of human consciousness. And he's written many books about all different aspects of human consciousness, from to do with do you have a Damon, to near-death experiences, that kind of thing. He regularly appears on radio programs all around the world. He hosts his own web-based radio programs, the Peake Experience, Schrodinger's Diary, and Anthony Peake Consciousness Hours, and he's written many articles in many magazines across the mind, body, spirit world. But with us, he's specifically working on a book called Time and the Rose Garden, which is encountering the magical in the life and works of J.B. Priestley. And Anthony was the keynote speaker at the annual J.B. Priestley lecture event at Queen Mary University in London a couple of years ago. And he's a member of the Society of Psychical Research, the Scientific and Medical Network, and the J.B. Priestley Society as well. Hello Anthony, welcome.
Hi there.
We've got lots to talk about, I think, and this is a really big subject. We don't have a huge amount of time, but J.B. Priestley was a popular writer, mainly playwright, a scriptwriter from the 20th century. Could you tell us a little bit about who he was and how you came to be interested in his work?
Yeah, absolutely. J.B. Priestley was born in 1894 in Bradford in Yorkshire. He spent his first few years training as a person working within the wool trade within Yorkshire. And in the First World War, he volunteered and ended up... Just hold on a second. Oh, shit. Sorry, excuse my French. Yeah, it's just playing silly sods. Would you be able to cut that out? Okay, fine. Okay, I'll start again with the J.B. Priestley. Obviously, it's decided it wants to update something, which is always the way. Maybe if I come off the web and it will stop doing this. Let's just hold on. If I close the windows. Right, they're all closed, and they're closed. Right, that should now stop things coming in. Okay, right. Shall I just start again with Priestley then? Okay. Yeah, J.B. Priestley was born in 1890. I'll start again. Now that's gone wrong. Okay, let's try again. Okay, we're back again. Okay, yeah, J.B. Priestley was born in 1894 in Yorkshire, in Bradford. And for the first few years of his life, when he'd actually left school, he trained to work in the wool trade. However, as the First World War broke out, he decided to volunteer to fight for the British in the First World War. And when he came back, he was given the opportunity, a life opportunity, to go to Cambridge University. And from then on, he decided he wanted to be a writer. And this is exactly what he did. And he had a series of quite successful novels in the early 1920s and early 1930s. But he decided he wanted to be a playwright. And over the years, he wrote a whole series of plays and became the voice of Britain in the Second World War during the very, very difficult years from 1931 to about 1941-42, when Britain stood alone against Germany. After the war, he continued writing and eventually died in 1984. But Priestley has a reputation for being a very old-fashioned writer, and my opinion of Priestley is he's far from an old-fashioned writer. In fact, he was so far ahead of the curve that most people consider him old-fashioned because they clearly didn't understand what he was writing about. Now, I've been interested in Priestley ever since I was at university. Indeed, after I wrote my book, The Damon, I was given an opportunity to speak at the National Theatre in front just before a production of Time and the Conways. And whilst I was there, I was introduced to Tom Priestley, J.B. Priestley's son, and also members of the Priestley family. And since then, my relationship has built up with them. And it was through the ministrations of Tom Priestley that I decided that I had a J.B. Priestley book in me. And this is the book that we're now talking about. Yeah, and Inspector Calls, I think, is both the most popular work he's done and probably the most negative work he's done, because it's on the GCSE curriculum, and therefore an awful lot of English literature students are introduced to Priestley through an Inspector Calls, which is a wonderful play. It's a very, very clever play. It's very well thought through, but it tends to switch people off a little bit because it has this slightly arch 1930s, 1940s feel. And because of the archaic use of language that he does, it does tend to switch people off a little bit, which is extremely sad because he wrote a whole series of plays, some of which are absolutely stunning in how clever they are and how they play with the audience. And Inspector Calls is considered to be one of his, quote, time plays. But effectively, the major time plays he wrote were plays such as I Have Been Here Before, and the very, very spectacular and very, very clever play called Time and the Conways, which I'm happy to talk about if you're interested.
Yeah, well, I think, I'll get onto that in a minute, but just really quickly, for anyone who hasn't seen Inspector Calls, I don't want to give it away, but there's a kind of quite a big metaphysical twist in there, isn't there?
Oh, totally. I would hate to give away the storyline, but nothing is as it seems. And it's a very, very clever morality play about guilt and responsibility and who is responsible for the death of a young woman. But within it, there is the inspector himself is a very, very curious character. And the twist is that we don't quite know who the inspector is and what he stands for. And this is typical of Priestley. Priestley was heavily into metaphysics. When he was at university, he studied a great deal of metaphysics. And all through his life, he was an extensive reader of the mysterious and the mystic. So
what you're saying is, like, you can almost, it's easy if, at first glance, or, because of the old-fashioned language, or it's easy to sort of write him off as old school English and a bit fuddy-duddy and a bit irrelevant. But actually, and you say this in the book as well, actually he was in touch with kind of Eastern metaphysical ideas, which are now prevalent everywhere at a very young age from a quite provincial background. And he also, being a young fighter in the war, he also had some kind of mystical experiences when he fought as well.
He did. He had a series of mystery experiences and altered states of consciousness while he was in the trenches. Yeah. But also, he had a series of curious events even around when he volunteered. He could have chosen to have joined the Bradford Pals, because in the First World War, at the start of the First World War, the logic of the British government was that you took groups of people from the same village or the same town and put them into the same regiment, the logic being that they would know each other and they would look after each other. Of course, the tragedy was that on the first day of the Somme, effectively whole villages, males from villages, were completely wiped out because, of course, so many people were killed. But for some peculiar reason, on the day that he was about to register and join the British Army, he didn't register in Bradford. He walked down to Leeds and joined the Yorkshire Regiment, which was quite a different regiment. And it seems that from that stage onwards, he felt that something was watching over him. Yeah. He felt that there was a kind of guiding spirit in his life, and he had 2 or 3 incredibly lucky escapes during the First World War. But what he also noticed was that soldiers who were about to die seemed to know that they were about to die, and he noticed this many, many times. And as he became older, he became fascinated by precognition and time, and how it is that certain individuals can somehow know what's about to happen in the future.
Yeah, and So certain soldiers would know they're about to die, and also their experience of time would change at those moments, wouldn't it? It would.
Correct.
Yeah.
Correct. As you may be aware, and a lot of my readers will be aware, I wrote a book called The Labyrinth of Time around about 7 or 8 years ago, and this was a discussion on the psychology of time and the psychology of time perception, and the way it is under certain circumstances, whether it is stress, whether it is fever related, whatever it is, time seems to slow down. And this is one of these great mysteries that most people experience at least once in their life. When they're in an accident, time slows down. But of course, the difficulty here is that time is the only thing that I know that's measured by itself. So you can have a pound of apples, but you can only ever have a minute of a minute. So my minute might be completely different to your minute. So therefore, if I say time seems to be dilating and spreading out for me, I've got no way of proving it to you, and vice versa. And this was again something that intrigued Priestley. Now, because when he was a young man, he became very interested in Vedanta, which is a Hindu philosophy on the nature of reality and whether reality itself is some form of illusion, something called Maya. These weaved into him these ideas of, well, what can we say to say that we are conscious and that we are aware and we're perceiving something? Is there more to this? And this was the major theme of his life and the major theme of his writing.
So obviously this is super interesting. It's interesting if you're interested in these ideas already, and it's going to make J.B. Priestley a writer worth checking out. But also, if you're already a fan of J.B. Priestley, this is going to kind of unlock a whole new kind of level of meaning to his plays. Because you were saying a lot of this stuff has been overlooked by people.
Oh, totally. When I first started considering writing a book on J.B. Priestley, none of my previous publishers were interested, and that's why I was delighted when O-Books said, no, we're interested, we'll take this. And it was the lines were that either he's too old-fashioned, or that he will never, nobody's interested in America in J.B. Priestley. And my argument is people are not interested in J.B. Priestley because they do not appreciate the power of his writing and the way in which he goes deeply into philosophy. For instance, he was hugely influenced by a Russian philosopher called Peter Ouspensky, and wrote a book called I Have Been Here Before, based upon the theories of Ouspensky, who worked with Gurdjieff. He was also fascinated by an Anglo-Irish aeronautical engineer called John William Dunn, J.W. Dunn, who in the late 1920s wrote a hugely popular book about perception of time called An Experiment with Time. And these books fascinated him so much that he wove them into his plays. I Have Been Here Before very much takes the theories of Ouspensky and the idea of something called the eternal recurrence or the eternal return, the idea that we live our lives over and over again. Now, the reason I'm particularly interested in Priestley's angle on this is my first book deals specifically with this topic and the idea, and I do the neurology and the quantum physics of how this could be a real thing that people can perceive. He was also fascinated by the Thodo Bodo, the Tibetan Book of the Dead. And in 1939, he wrote an incredible play that only, I think, ran for about 20 performances, called Johnson over Jordan. And Johnson over Jordan is about a near-death experience. Now, of course, in the late 1930s, nobody had ever heard of near-death experiences. But here is Priestley writing about near-death experiences in a play that is very, very rarely performed. He was also fascinated by Carl Jung. And he wrote a series of plays with his then wife, Jacquetta Hawkes, about the idea of the different departments of personality that we have. He also wrote about time slips. He was a fascinating writer, very, very exciting.
Wonderful. And you mentioned I've Been Here Before and Time and the Conways. And could you tell me a little bit how those plays are shaped and how the metaphysical works into those plays? And do you explore that in the book a bit as well?
I do indeed. I Have Been Here Before is an intriguing plot line. And it's a plot line that people don't get. I recently saw a production of it in the Germain Theatre in London just before last Christmas. And in this, I could tell the surprise of the audience because they didn't understand. And what is taking place is the central character, who's a character called Dr. Gortler, is somebody who lives his life over and over again. And he knows in a previous iteration of his life, he knows of a young couple who make a terrible, terrible mistake. They make a very, very bad decision. And what he does is, when he's living his life again, he engineers himself to be in this inn in Yorkshire, in the Yorkshire Dales, to make sure that he can intervene in the life of this young couple to make sure they don't make the decision they made last time. So that is the central premise of I Have Been Here Before. And Gortler discusses in great detail a lot of quantum physics and everything else, because, of course, in the late 1930s, quantum mechanics was very much in vogue. So people were very interested in this. In Time and the Conways, it's even cleverer. It's a 3-act play. And the first act is a family, a mother and 3 daughters and a son, who were celebrating the end of the First World War. And at the end of the First World War, there was this great feeling of optimism. The economy wasn't doing too badly in the UK, and they're planning what they're going to do with their wealth, what they're going to do with the house. At the end, and it's Kay Conway, the central character, one of the daughters, it's her 21st birthday. At the end of the first act, Kay Conway goes into some kind of sleep state. And as you see her just go to sleep on stage, and then the curtain comes down. The curtain comes up for the second act, and the first act is 1919. The second act is the same room, but clearly from the fashions and the dress of the people, it's 1937, 1938. Now, it is a normal device in plays that, you have the first act based at one time and the second act based in another. So initially, the audience isn't, there's nothing odd about it, until you start to realize that the older Kay Conway character starts to react strangely when certain things are said to her in the second act. And you realize she's in a dream sequence. She's dreaming the future. And at the end of the second act, she has a discussion with her brother. And her brother explains that there are parallel times. And these parallel times all exist concurrently. And it depends on your psychology. The third act starts, and she comes to with all the knowledge of what she's gleaned from the third act, from the second act into the third act. So it is so cleverly done. Now, I saw a version of this directed by Rupert Gould at the National Theatre, the one I spoke before. And there were some very clever devices to get across to the audience just what Priestley's talking about. Like, they had a group of actresses all wearing the same clothes, dressed as Kay Conway, all in slightly different positions, moving to the back of the stage. And they used a strobe light. And you had the illusion of movement. Edward Murbridge, who was a British photographer, used to do these kind of images. And it's the way of getting over how time is in slices. It's actually Minkowski. But the play is so powerful. And now I think I'm one of the first writers to really look into the physics and the philosophy that supports the ideas in these great, great plays.
I see. So, and so a couple of things. So obviously it seems to me like these, although there might be certain people who have a certain reputation, obviously seems he's never really stopped being put on. And it seems, I mean, tell me if you think it's different, but it seems to me he's still inspiring a lot of creativity with directors, and it can still be put on in a very accessible and powerful way.
To an extent, that is true. I mean, last Christmas they did a version of the Inspector Calls, which was on BBC, and it was a very, very expensive version. I saw Tom afterwards, Tom Priestley. By the way, Tom Priestley, J.B. Priestley's son, is famous in his own right because he actually was nominated for an Oscar for the editing for the movie Deliverance, dueling banjos and everything. So he made his own reputation over there, but that's an aside, really. But people are sort of inspired by him, but they miss the point. Now, what I'm very, very excited about, and in the book I discuss this, is that Tom was able to give me access both to two things: a series of letters that were written to J.B. Priestley in 1963, and also he had sent to me a document that is virtually unknown, an unknown J.B. Priestley play. called Time Was, Time Is. And I'm working with a guy called Braham Murray. And Braham is trying to get this play on the West End, probably next year or the year after. And we think if we can play this right, we'll actually bring Priestley right back into the modern format, because this new play is his best play on time. And you can see in it how everything from The Matrix to most of the really iconic science fiction movies of the last 20 years, 30 years, had in their central core ideas that Priestley was playing about with years ago.
Yeah, I was about to say that, because in a way he's like the precursor to all these massive sort of metaphysical movies, like, you know, The Matrix. Even Groundhog Day came to mind, that idea of repeating the same day over and over again. You know, they're massively popular.
Oh, totally. I mean, this is why I get so frustrated, in the sense that I wrote the last biography of Philip K. Dick, the science fiction author. So I'm quite knowledgeable about Philip K. Dick, having spent a year writing a book on him and interviewing a lot of people that knew him. But Philip K. Dick was no more into philosophy and ideas than J.B. Priestley was. They were both very, very similar characters, very different in other ways, but very, very similar in the philosophy that stimulated their ideas and their thoughts. And although Philip K. Dick did influence movies like The Matrix, because the Wachowski brothers acknowledged the fact that he influenced them, Priestley is far more subtle. Priestley doesn't influence people because people don't know, because people don't get it. I'm hoping with this book that suddenly a little light will go on and people will go, my God, this guy was unbelievable. And that is my hope anyway.
You know, your passion and enthusiasm is, you know, tangible and inspiring. So, you know, I have high hopes like yourself. And I was going to ask you, you know, like you said, you know, part of what your previous work is, you know, talking about metaphysical concepts in terms of current science and current technological thinking, and you're bringing your scientific chops to those ideas. Are you working in the same area here with this book at all?
Yes, yeah. Very much so, very much so. More, I touch upon the quantum physics, because one of the areas that fascinates me is what quantum physics tells us about the true nature of reality. And of course, anybody that really goes into quantum physics in any great detail will realize that the reality we believe is solid reality is not at all solid. Subatomic particles actually flit in and out of existence. We know that the act of observation and the act of measurement has a direct relationship to a subatomic particle moving from being a statistical wave function to being a point particle. Now, if this is the case, Priestley's ideas have resonance, because that's what he argues, is that, you know, what really is reality. And of course, what intrigues me is, as a playwright, he was very much creating alternate realities. He was creating the mythos of the stage play, where people effectively abdicate their beliefs for an hour or two and believe that what is happening on the stage is somehow a reflection of people's real lives. And this intrigued him as well, you know. So there were a lot of areas, and I touch on the quantum physics to a degree, but it's also the philosophy. And I think it's particularly his angle on philosophy. I bring in Nietzsche, I bring in a great deal of the famous philosophers from the past, and the way in which he wove these ideas into his plays, but in such a subtle way that most people don't pick them up. I've been surprised that even people that are considered to be Priestley scholars, who have written books on Priestley, miss the point so regularly. It's almost as if he was writing so esoterically, but so cleverly, and people see the storyline without seeing the message that's behind it.
Do you think he was doing it because is it partly a conscious thing that he knew he was writing for maybe an audience where it would be difficult to present these ideas directly, or do you think he was almost too good for his own good and was too good an artist and ended up being too subtle?
He used to use the term the well-crafted play, and he was probably, as a playwright, a literal playwright. He was somebody that could create a play and create the format of a play. He initially wrote to entertain, and it's entertainment that was his initial ideas. But he also wanted to educate. But because there were other writers at the time who were considered to be far more intellectual than he was. I mean, for instance, the critics at the time never considered him to be on the same level as writers such as George Bernard Shaw. Whereas, in fact, I would argue that in terms of intellectual capacity, Priestley was far deeper than George Bernard Shaw ever was. In fact, one of the things I discovered by reading up into the background, and I'm now a very good friend with J.B. Priestley's great-grandson, Luke, and Luke and I were discussing this recently, was the way in which writers like Borges, Jorge Borges, who was an incredible Argentinian writer, and the writers of magical realism in Latin America in the 1920s, 30s, and 40s, Borges goes on and on about how brilliant Priestley was. So people who really appreciate, and it clicks with them, they understand and they see the nuances. What I'm trying to do with this book is to introduce the general public to why it is that Priestley wrote what he did and how he did it. Now, I'm also intrigued about him as a writer. In my book, The Damon, A Guide to Your Extraordinary Secret Self, I discuss creativity, where creativity comes from. And this was something that fascinated Priestley. He sometimes felt that the stories and the plots and the dialogue downloaded itself from somewhere else. Excuse me. He was almost a cipher or a medium for the message.
I've heard a lot of authors say that. Well, I've heard Jez Butterworth, who's a big famous current playwright. He says it's not me who writes, he's writing it. and is it Ben Okri wrote the poem about a Grenfell Tower? I can't remember. I think it might have been. He said exactly the same thing. He said, I didn't write it. The poem just came through me. And I think all true writers will have experienced that.
Well, I find myself, that when I'm writing, there can be days where I cannot write at all and it doesn't flow. And then there'll be a day when I think, it's not going to work today. And suddenly and the words and the structure and the nuances and the alliteration and everything else just happens. And to me, this is, I have something I call the Damonadal dyad, which I argue that there are two elements to the human personality. And I apply the ideas of bicameralism of Julian Jaynes. I also apply the ideas of the split brain operations of Roger Sperry, Michael Gazzaniga. And there is evidence that there is two centers of consciousness within the brain. And I believe that sometimes under given circumstances, we, an everyday personality, can access the thoughts of that other part of us, the daemon. And I argue that the daemon is the immortal part of us. And in fact, my last book, Opening the Doors of Perception, was a book about taking the ideas of the Opening the Doors of Perception, the Aldous Huxley 1954 book, and updating it in relation to 21st century neurology. And again, the message I'm trying to get across is that creativity just flows. You just need to, it's like that wonderful phenomenon, isn't it? When you can't think of something. So what do? You don't continue trying to remember it. You let your mind go blank and it suddenly drops into your mind by magic. And I believe it's because the brain works on holographic principles. It's non-local. The brain is non-local. The brain communicates in non-local ways. So in which case you can access the memories like that, but you can't do it on a conscious level. It has to be in the subconscious.
Great. Wow. So many ideas. There's so many ideas I'd love to ask you about. I want to try and keep it focused on some of the J.B. Priestley work and time. Maybe you could say something about some of the concepts of time you explored that maybe touched on his work. I think the big book you talk about the three different types of time. Is that right?
Yes.
And,
yes.
And we can look at time in three different ways.
Yeah, the idea, it was J.W. Dunn that effectively came up with this concept of serial time. And this is what is the background to Time and the Conways. And the idea is that, and it's quite complex until you really think about it. And the idea is Marcus Aurelius and various other philosophers have always argued that time is like a river. It flows. and the flow of time. But a moment's reflection will make you think, hold on a minute. If time flows, there must be something that time flows against. We know that a river flows because we can see the river flowing in the riverbanks. But we are within time, so we're within the river. So it's in fact the riverbanks that tell us whether we are flowing along. But in order for time to flow, it has to flow against something else. It has to have something that it can be timed against. This is where J.W. Dunn argued that there is another time, time 2, which time 1 moves against. And this is what allows us to understand time flow. It's something that Philip K. Dick, although he knew nothing of J.W. Dunn, in my research I found he knew nothing of J.W. He may have done, but he never wrote about him, is that there's an orthogonal time which runs at a right angle to our own time. Now, this was used very, very powerfully in a recent movie called Interstellar. I don't know if you remember in Interstellar, there was something called a Tesseract sequence where the main character looks back over the life of his daughter from the 6th dimension, looking into the 5th dimension, into the 4th, and the other dimensions of space-time. And he sees her whole life in this kind of Tesseract sequence. Now, this is what J.W. Dunn said. Now, if there are other times that exist, Dunn and Priestley believe that there will be a version of us or a consciousness of us that also exists in the time outside time. Now, again, J.B. Priestley was fascinated by something called the specious present. And the specious present is, how long does now last? It's one of these big questions, isn't it? When we say now, what do we mean? The past has already gone. The future is yet to exist, but we all exist in this kind of split-second moment, which is now, which is continually changing. Now, Priestley argued, and Dunn argued, that specious present can be made wider and broader, which means under certain circumstances, we can perceive the immediate future. And this is how precognition works. And J.W. Dunn, the reason J.W. Dunn wrote about time was that he had a series of precognitions himself. And the precognitions were so powerful that he came to believe that when we precognize an event, like, I don't know, in our generation, 9/11, we precognize not the event, but the reading of the newspaper articles or seeing it on television. And there's an argument to say that under certain states of mind, which I call it, but technically it's something called the hypnagogic and hypnopompic states, which is that state when you're semi-awake and semi-asleep, you can access a broader idea of what time is, and you can perceive the future. This is exactly what he's trying to do with time, because time is such a mystery. So St. Augustine once said, and he turned around and he said that time, when I don't think about time, I can understand it. Everybody does, until you start to think about it. And then it seems to vanish in your hands. It doesn't make sense anymore. But it's something we all exist within.
And Priestley on the stage, like you said, it's creating a magical world. So it's kind of a way to explore these kind of slightly mind-bending experiences, because you can do that. You can jump forward in time, but it appears to be the same time, but it's not the same time. Or you can play with those things, can't you? And you can.
He does it wonderfully in Johnson over Jordan. In Johnson over Jordan, the central character, Jordan, has just died. And he's in the Bardo state. But he's able to witness his own funeral and people discussing him at the funeral. But then he's able to go back to elements of his own past. It's almost similar to, I don't know, A Christmas Carol, Dickens, where he can go back and witness scenes from his own past. Now, of course, this again comes back to the near-death experience and the idea that you have the past life review, the panoramic life review, the idea my life passed before my eyes, the idea that when in a near-death experience, you experience not only your own life, but the effects your decisions had on other people. And this is, again, the central theme of Johnson over Jordan. Again, an incredibly clever play, but it went over everybody's head. I mean, in fact, he spent a fortune on it. He had Benjamin Britten do the music. They had a dance troupe. They had choreographers, top choreographers for dancers. Now, again, I'm working with the Priestley family to see if there is a way that we can get a version of this on again, to get this play back again.
It's not like people love plays with deep intellectual content. There's like people love Tom Stoppard for doing exactly the same thing.
Exactly.
And it's not like I'm just thinking. It seems like these ideas don't really go away, even if sort of if they appear in one religion or something like that, and even if that gets discredited or goes out of fashion, then they come again in quantum physics. They reappear again, or they reappear again in.
It's what Aldous Huxley used the term the perennial philosophy. And there are certain, and I've argued this in all my books, that there is an underlying reality and an underlying belief system that is found in all societies, and it is found in all religions and all philosophies. And it manifests usually in the mystical traditions of the great religions. I mean, for example, in Sufism, in Gnosticism, and the Kabbalah, for instance, within the Abrahamic religions. But even within the Indian religions, the concept of Maya, the concept of reality as an illusion. Because what we're looking into now is the biggest question that modern science has to answer, and how it is that electricity reacting with chemicals in your brain create Ben, create Tony. What is it that brings that about? And for me, this is the biggest question, and this has been the theme of my writing for the last decade. What do we mean when we say we are conscious? What do we mean when we say we observe? Who is doing the observing? What's looking out of your eyes? J.B. Priestley argues in Time and the Conways, are we the same person that we were in our childhood? We change, our body changes physiologically over that period of time. What is the continuity? And the only continuity is the observer and memory. Now, again, in some of his other plays, he has a fascinatingly unknown play called Desert Highway, which he wrote in, I think, in the 1941, 42. And it's a group of English soldiers in the Iraqi desert in the Second World War. And there's a huge time slip. And they become warriors from the time of Mesopotamia. The second act, all the characters, the same characters, but they're transposed into an earlier time. And he was doing this all the time, and people were just not getting it, because you have to be able to put these ideas in a structure. The audience has to appreciate, and I think time is now correct for J.B. Priestley to be really appreciated. We now live in a postmodern society. We understand postmodernism. We are all fascinated now by virtual reality, the idea of a way in which we can create, by using an Oculus Rift, a virtual reality we can move within. The idea that consciousness and perception are far stranger than we'd ever imagined. These are all themes that Priestley was looking at years ago. I feel very sorry for him that he didn't have the opportunity I've had to go into the physics, go into the neurology, and to be able to conceptualize the mysteries of consciousness.
And I agree with you. I think it's a great moment to be putting all this out there and reviving his name. And I really hope that your various production projects continue and get more traction as the year goes on. So it's fantastic listening to you speak. And if you're listening to this and you want to hear more of Anthony speak and check out more of his work, I'm going to say what are you up to at the moment? When's the book out, and where can people find you if they want to get in touch with you and all that jazz?
Okay, yeah. At the moment, I also work as a management consultant. So at the moment, I'm actually finishing off a contract at the National Gallery in London. The book is out at the end of January. I'm hoping, it looks like I'll be speaking on the book at Alternatives in Piccadilly in January or February. I'm discussing that with Alternatives at the moment. I will also be speaking about the book at the Bradford Literature Festival in the early summer. And there'll also be a lot of series of events. And in fact, in January, on my own podcast, the Anthony Peake Consciousness Hour, Luke Goerman Dodgson, who's Priestley's great-grandson, will be interviewing me on the book on my podcast. In terms of contacting me, I'm extremely active on Facebook. I also have a very, very active website. I have thousands and thousands of readers from across the world, and it's building up a momentum because all my books have a theme, and more people are getting involved in it now. We are trying to change the way people think, and by joining in with what I'm trying to do in my own limited way is the way of moving this forward to try and change the paradigm. The scientific paradigm we have now is stuck in a rut. We need to realize that in order to fully explain the true nature of reality, we have to include consciousness, and we have to use experience, and we have to bring in experiences and everything else as well. So contact me on Facebook. I'm up to my 5,000 friends, because they limit you on 5,000, but people are continually dropping out or coming off Facebook, and you can still follow me on Facebook. If you want to go onto the website, all my videos on YouTube and everything else are there. There is literally hours and hours and hours of material listening to me rabbit on like this. So so that's the background.
Wonderful. Yeah, really exciting to be working on you with this book, and I'm wishing it all the best in 2018. It's so much fun to talk about all this, and it's also inspiring. So we'll make sure all that information goes up. But thanks so much for coming on. It's been a real pleasure.
Thanks very much, Ben, for listening to my witterings.
Fantastic. Thank you. That was great.
Great.